Hello my friends, welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So my friends, I'm not entirely sure if my audience, if any of you have really been following the debate that has been happening over the past week or so, and really over a very long period of time in general, over child labor laws. So let me just give you some context. The New Hampshire Libertarian Party chairman, or Libertarian Party at least, they're on their Twitter account, they called for an end to child labor laws. Let me give you an exact excerpt from their tweet. They said, legalize child labor. Children will learn more on a job site than in public school. The New Hampshire Libertarian Party wrote on Twitter last Monday. At the very least, the minimum age to work is a states' rights issue. Federal minimum wage laws are unconstitutional, to which you had Gary Johnson, the former Libertarian Presidential nominee, someone who I think is not even sufficiently libertarian whatsoever. He actually enjoys using the state to force his own agenda upon people in many instances, carbon taxes being one of them. He says, I'm sorry, but no. This is not what libertarianism means to millions of Americans. Pushing out a disturbing and out-of-touch stance on child labor is entirely detached from what people need in America today. This does not advance liberty or help change people's opinions. Well, I have news for Mr. Johnson. Just because a position is out of touch does not mean it is incorrect. And just because people understand a certain position in a certain way does not mean that their understanding of that position is correct. To derive meaning from popular understandings is to accept the atrocities that have happened so long in history that have been based upon popular understandings. Here's my point. Popular understandings have no bearing on the merits of an idea. The idea's tenets itself have bearing on its merits. Simple. But let's get back to this broader idea of child labor. I'm not saying the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire was correct, but I am saying they have given us necessary fodder to inject into our political discourse a consideration of these principles. So what is child labor? According to one of the most active and prolific anti-child labor groups in the world, the International Labor Organization, they define child labor as work that is mentally, physically, socially, and morally dangerous and harmful to children, and interferes with their schooling by depriving them of the opportunity to attend school, obliging them to leave school prematurely, or requiring them to attempt to combine school attendance with excessively long and heavy work. So you have a lot of adjectives and values fused into that one statement, and that statement itself seems rather arbitrary for one particular reason. Whenever child labor is talked about, the principle itself is not talked about. The context in which the principle operates historically, or has operated historically, is what is talked about. Let me give you an example. When you hear the word child labor, when someone hears the word child labor, they hear a world in the early 20th century, in 1900s, where children were in factories being exploited. They were sick to their stomach. They became frail because they were being overworked. And they think that is what people are talking about when they talk about child labor. Or they hear the international definition that these people have put out. They see children being sexually exploited in factories, children being put into trafficking and working for people. They see all kinds of negative things, which fundamentally are secondary to the idea of child labor itself. My friends, all a child labor is the act of someone who is young laboring. That by itself is a morally uninteresting concept. That by itself does not really give us much fodder by which to examine ethical principles. But the context that have historically surrounded that activity is what gives us fodder. So for example, if I have a hammer and a nail and I strike the hammer into the nail and I nail something on the board, that by itself is not morally interesting. Okay, I'm striking nail with a hammer, and I'm nailing something up on the board. Now, if I was forced at gunpoint to do so, and told if I didn't do so in 10 minutes I would get shot in the head, that's what's morally reprehensible. We tend to confuse context with meaning, context with principles, and that is fundamentally bad for our understanding of certain topics. But then there's also the fact that a lot of people, at least in America, because I don't want to talk about the international child labor issue. I'll make a separate video about that. In America, there is this aversion towards children, people under the age of 12 or working or whatever, or if they do work under or the age of 12, if they do work, they have to be under certain conditions, because there are so many risks associated with certain kinds of work. So, for example, in the United States, let me just read you off some facts. In the United States, for non-agricultural jobs, children under 14 may not be employed. Children between 14 and 16 may be employed in allowed occupations during limited hours, and children between 16 and 17 may be employed for unlimited hours in non-hazardous occupations. Now, there are numerous exceptions to this broader rules. These are rules that come from the Fair Standards Act of 1938. There are exceptions, though. If you have a parental thing you're doing with your parents, if it's an agricultural job, children are able to work for a very long time or work at all under those circumstances. And there have been labor organizations in the United States agitating against this on the basis that children are being put in front of hazardous chemicals. Children are being put in front of hazardous chemicals like pesticides in farms, and children are being, taken out of school, or they're having to sacrifice school time to work, and that shouldn't happen. So underlying this critique is the idea of a risk. My friends, every last thing in this world has a risk. Life itself is simply a very long process of risk, of probability, of things that could happen, might happen, we don't know because the future is unwritten. As the great Natasha Bedingfield said, one of my favorite singers, the rest of your story is unwritten. So when we take the unwritten and we incorporate the unwritten into our analysis, we're necessarily going to probably get the wrong assumptions. If you're trying to avoid risks, you're trying to avoid life. And if you're trying to avoid life, child labor is the least of your worries. Now, does this mean that kids should be put intentionally into dangerous circumstances? Of course not. No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that there are conditions under which a child could labor in agriculture, and most of the time when children do that, it's not them being slaved or anything. It is them working for a family member, working for the family farm. There are conditions that can be created for that child to safely accomplish those tasks. And when risk is reduced, it is never eliminated. But when risk is reduced towards hazardous activities, the sort of moral justification against children in America laboring on the family farm because there's pesticides becomes a little bit more impotent. It becomes a little bit more less sensible. Because again, this entire debate is phrased around a moral objection to an action which, as I mentioned before, and I'm repeating myself for a reason, has no inherent moral quality to it. Context is dominating, not meaning. So, you may ask, Christian, what is the morally interesting problem with child labor? Let me tell you. It is the advent and the use of force and coercion to further certain conditions in which children were not free and they were malnourished and they were exploited. Force and coercion are the morally consequential factors of child labor. The fact that before we had labor standards or whatever, children were forced into factories, they were exploited by their parents, or they were exploited by certain people, is a condemnable thing. But it's not condemnable because they were working, it's condemnable because they were coerced. And the interesting thing about this is that the entire debate, the entire effort actually, to prevent child labor in America emerges from a paradigm of force and coercion. Back in the early 1900s, when there were labor groups agitating to ban child labor or to greatly restrict it, their solution was, we're going to ban child labor, but we're also going to enact truancy laws and make education in America compulsory. That was their solution to getting rid of child labor. They essentially they traded one form of coercion, which was the context that surrounded child labor, not child labor itself, for another form of coercion, which is the context that surrounds education, not education itself. That is what has happened, my friends. And the idea that truancy laws exist and that kids should be in school has been so profoundly ingrained into our culture because it has been put against a backdrop of an activity which has been vilified because of its associations. Education is important, my friends, but moral incorrectness is moral incorrectness regardless of who's doing it, regardless of what it's going towards. And even though education is a good thing, there have been many cases in the United States education system, and there are many cases to be made, that this system itself is actually a kind of forced child labor or forced adolescent labor or whatever. Because it is the state telling a kid that they must go to a particular institution, that they must do X, Y, or Z, they must have a particular kind of activity unless they want to get penalized. And it gives no deference to the principle of individual choice. My friends, individual choice is what should rule the day in this question. If a kid feels the need or the want to avoid education or have education and go on the farm to work, have education and go in their mom's flower shop to work, or have education, if the kid feels the need to step outside of the orthodox paradigm upon which education is situated in America, then that should be their individual choice. Because ultimately, my friends, it is their life, it is their skills, it is their rights, it's no one else's. And this sort of sanctimonious do-gooding that so many opponents of quote-unquote child labor, which really isn't, which, as I mentioned before, is associated with a bunch of bad things and is guilty by association, a lot of them have a certain idea of what children should be doing. They should be in the classroom, being taught certain things, and being complicit in what they're being taught. But sometimes, my friends, the classroom is actually a more morally concerning context than a kid out in the field voluntarily working, toiling, and building skills. So this is not me justifying the conditions of so many other countries where kids are actually are forced to work into certain things. They actually are trafficked to work. I'm not saying this is nothing to do with that. I'm saying that if you remove the coercive aspects which have dogged the concept of child labor since its inception, and you recognize that the debate in the United States has been formulated from coercion, trading one kind of coercion, the exploitation of children, for another kind of coercion, we can actually get to an ethically sensible understanding of what it would mean for a kid to work. We can actually understand that, we can appreciate that, and we can do so without forcing anyone to do anything, and respecting the first principles of the American experiment. Think on it. My friends, I love you so much, and if you love me, please, patreon.com/officialcwatson or PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com, locals, christianwatson.locals.com. Email me, like, subscribe, comment, share this video, do whatever you can. But most importantly, my friends, I love you, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys. Love you.